Welcome to True Tomorrows, the show where we separate tomorrow's reality from science fiction. I'm Adrian Smith, and I'm so glad you're here.
And I'm Julia Jones, ready for another wild ride into the future.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Today we're diving into a story that explores the dark side of innovation. Think greed, unchecked ambition, and wait for it, ghost ships.
Yep, you heard that right. Ghost ships. This story asks, what happens when cutting corners and chasing profits lead to disaster on the high seas? And what if those victims, what if they came back for revenge?
Okay, let's unpack this. The story is called Requiem Wave, and it paints a picture of a future where a tycoon named Admiral Stone has built a massive shipping empire.
But like you mentioned, this empire has a dark secret lurking beneath the surface. What's fascinating here is that Stone's pursuit of wealth came at a terrible cost. He ignored safety regulations, used substandard materials. Basically, he did everything he could to maximize profit, even if it meant putting lives at risk.
And that's where the Requiem Wave comes in. His ship sees death traps start sinking, and the ocean, well, it doesn't forget. The story introduces us to the sea wraiths, spectral figures who were once the victims of Stone's negligence. You might recall that chilling line from the story. The sea remembers what the living forget.
And these sea wraiths aren't just your typical wispy ghosts. They're described as spectral sailors aboard these decaying ships, their sails, tattered cannons glowing with an eerie, almost bioluminescent light. It's like the ocean itself is giving them form, fueling their rage.
Speaking of rage, they're definitely out for revenge. Their target Stone and his most prized vessel, the Leviathan. This ship is the pinnacle of his ambition, a technological marvel that also represents everything wrong with his empire.
The Leviathan is interesting because it isn't just a symbol of Stone's ambition. It also highlights the fragility of complex technology. Despite all its advanced systems, it's ultimately vulnerable to the forces of nature and the wrath of the sea wraiths.
It's like the story is saying that no matter how advanced we become, we can't escape the consequences of our actions.
Exactly. And that's where things get really interesting. Stone, realizing he's in danger, tries to appease the sea wraiths. He offers them wealth reparations, anything to make amends for his past sins.
But the sea wraiths aren't interested in material things. They want something far more unsettling. They want Stone to experience true fear, the kind of fear he inflicted on his crews when they realized their ships were sinking. It's like a twisted form of poetic justice, don't you think?
Absolutely. And the way this story portrays this is just terrifying. The sea wraiths conjure a massive storm waves, defying the laws of physics, almost like they're being manipulated by some unseen force.
And remember that description of the ocean's memory. It's almost as if the collective anger and suffering of Stone's victims are being channeled through the ocean itself.
Right. It's not just a storm. It's a manifestation of their rage, their need for retribution. And the Leviathan, this symbol of Stone's power, is torn apart by the storm and the spectral onslaught. But here's the twist. Stone doesn't just die. He becomes one of them.
Whoa. Talk about a haunting fate, trapped forever as a sea wraith bound to the ocean and the consequences of his actions. It's a fate worse than death, some might say.
Definitely. And the story ends with this unsettling calm. The sea is quiet, but there's this haunting reminder that the dead may have their vengeance, but the ocean remembers. It leaves you wondering, is this the end or just the beginning of something even more unsettling?
That's a great question. And it makes me think, what would happen if something like this were to occur in the real world? Imagine if the consequences of environmental damage, corporate greed, and technological hubris manifested in such a tangible, terrifying way. It's a chilling thought.
It definitely is. It makes you question whether our pursuit of progress and innovation could inadvertently be creating our own sea wraiths, our own unintended consequences that will come back to haunt us.
Speaking of the real world, the idea of the ocean as a force that remembers and reacts to human actions might seem like pure fantasy, but it actually connects to some fascinating scientific concepts. Have you ever heard of bioluminescence?
Of course. It's the ability of living organisms to emit light. And it's actually quite common in marine life. Some species use it to attract mates, others to lure prey, and some even use it for defense, like creating a flash of light to startle predators.
Exactly. Now imagine that on a larger scale, with entire ecosystems reacting to changes in their environment. It might not be spectral ships and vengeful ghosts, but it could manifest as shifts in migration patterns, the emergence of new diseases, or even extreme weather events.
That's a really interesting connection. It makes you wonder if those events, those seemingly natural disasters, could be the ocean's way of responding to the stress we're putting on it.
Right. It's like the story is saying, hey, the ocean is alive, it's connected, and it's not going to sit idly by while we destroy it.
And this concept of interconnectedness isn't limited to the ocean. Scientists are increasingly finding evidence of complex communication and collective memory in animal groups, from insects to birds to primates. They might not be remembering specific events like the sea wraiths, but they're passing down information about food sources, migration routes, and even potential dangers shaping the behavior of future generations.
It's like the ocean or even the planet itself has a kind of collective consciousness, a way of processing information and reacting to change that we're only beginning to understand. And that's what makes Requiem Wave so thought-provoking. It takes these scientific ideas and weaves them into a captivating narrative that forces us to confront the potential consequences of our actions.
Absolutely. And it reminds us that the line between science fiction and reality might be blurrier than we think.
Okay, so we've got ghost ships, a greedy tycoon, and some serious questions about the price of progress and the ocean's long memory. But let's dive a little deeper into the world of Requiem Wave. What stands out to you about the sea wraiths themselves?
What's fascinating to me is that they're not just driven by a blind desire for revenge. They seem to have a specific goal to make Stone confront the consequences of his actions, to make him experience the fear and suffering he inflicted on others. They even spare his daughter, recognizing that she's not responsible for her father's sins. It suggests a level of moral complexity that we don't always see in traditional ghost stories.
That's a really interesting observation. It makes me think about the different interpretations of justice presented in the story. Is it about punishment, retribution? Or is it about something more profound, like accountability and understanding the ripple effects of our actions?
Right. It's like the sea wraiths are embodying a kind of karmic justice where Stone is forced to experience the consequences of his choices on a spiritual level, even beyond the physical realm of life and death.
Speaking of the spiritual realm, I'm curious about the mechanics of how the sea wraiths function. They can interact with the physical world, conjuring storms, manipulating objects, even transforming stone into one of them. It makes me wonder if there's a scientific explanation for this kind of spectral energy, or if it's purely a supernatural phenomenon.
That's a great question. And unfortunately, the story doesn't give us a definitive answer, but I think it's open to interpretation. Maybe it's some kind of undiscovered energy source, a form of quantum entanglement that connects the living and the dead. Or maybe it's simply a metaphorical representation of the enduring power of memory and trauma, a way for the past to literally haunt the present.
I like that the idea that the sea wraiths are a manifestation of collective trauma, the pain and suffering of those lost at sea, amplified and given form by the ocean's own memory.
And think about how that connects to real-world issues like environmental damage or social injustice. What if the consequences of those actions, the suffering they cause, leave a kind of energetic residue, a memory, that lingers long after the events themselves have passed?
Whoa, that's a heavy thought. But it's also a powerful reminder that our actions have consequences not just in the immediate sense, but on a deeper, more profound level that we might not even be able to comprehend.
Exactly. And that's what makes Requiem Wave so captivating. It takes these complex ideas about justice, revenge, and the interconnectedness of all things and weaves them into a thrilling narrative that stays with you long after you've finished reading it.
Well said. And on that note, I think it's time to wrap up part one of our deep dive into Requiem Wave.
But don't go anywhere just yet. We'll be back soon with part two, where we'll delve even deeper into the world of Requiem Wave and uncover even more unsettling truths about the future. Welcome back to True Tomorrows. We're picking up our deep dive into Requiem Wave, where we left off contemplating those unsettling consequences of unchecked ambition and that haunting reminder that the ocean never forgets.
You know, it's like the sea itself is a character in this story, a silent witness to human greed and the inevitable reckoning that follows.
Exactly. And that brings us to another layer of this tale, the sea wraiths themselves. Remember, they aren't just generic ghosts. They're specifically the victims of Stone's negligence bound to the very ships that became their watery graves.
Given your interest in maritime history, you might find it fascinating that the story draws a direct connection between the sea wraiths and the specific ships they haunt. It's not just a random assortment of ghosts. They're tied to the vessels that represent their final moments, their suffering. It adds this whole other layer of tragedy and personalization to their revenge.
Absolutely. It's almost as if their rage, their need for vengeance, is fueled by the ocean's own sense of violation. These ghost ships aren't just aimlessly drifting, they're instruments of retribution.
Right, and that raises a fascinating question. What does it mean for the future of this world? If the ocean itself is reacting to human actions, what happens when those actions continue unchecked?
Are we talking about some kind of ecological apocalypse? A world where the very environment turns against us? I mean, we see those themes echoed in real-world events like the Deepwater Horizon oil spill, the environmental devastation, the loss of life, the long-term consequences. It's a stark reminder that our actions have ripple effects far beyond what we can imagine.
Exactly. And Requiem Wave takes that concept to a whole other level, a supernatural level. It's not just about oil spills or climate change. It's about the ocean itself becoming a force of retribution.
It's like that old saying, those who cannot remember the past are condemned to repeat it. But in this case, it's the ocean that remembers, and it's humanity that might be condemned.
Precisely. And that's what makes Requiem Wave so powerful. It's not just a ghost story. It's a cautionary tale about the potential consequences of our actions, both individually and collectively.
So what can we do? Are we doomed to repeat Stone's mistakes, or is there a way to break the cycle?
That's the million-dollar question, isn't it? Requiem Wave doesn't offer any easy answers, but it does suggest that there's hope in remembering and acknowledging the past and learning from our mistakes.
Like the story emphasizes, it's about recognizing that our actions have consequences not just for ourselves, but for the world around us, for the very environment that sustains us.
You know, it's interesting that you bring up the environment. This idea of the ocean as a character, a force that remembers and reacts it, isn't entirely new. We see it in classic literature like Moby Dick, where the whale becomes this embodiment of nature's power and indifference to human ambition.
That's a great point. And Requiem Wave adds another layer to this tradition by giving the ocean not just power, but agency. It's not just a force to be reckoned with, it's an active participant in the story, a character with its own motivations and desires.
Those motivations are directly tied to human actions. It's like the story is saying, if you abuse the ocean, if you exploit it for your own gain, be prepared to face the consequences.
And those consequences might not always be what we expect. They might not be immediate or easily quantifiable, but they'll be profound and potentially devastating.
I think that's a really important takeaway from Requiem Wave.
Yeah.
It's a reminder that we need to be mindful of the choices we make, both in the way we develop and use technology and in the way we treat the environment.
Absolutely. And it's a reminder that even in a fictional world, there are lessons to be learned, truths to be uncovered, and questions that demand our attention.
Speaking of questions, I have one that's been bugging me. What happens to the other sea wraiths after Stone becomes one of them? Do they find peace? Do they disappear?
That's a great question, and unfortunately, the story doesn't give us a definitive answer, but I think it's open to interpretation. Maybe their vengeance is satisfied and they can finally rest. Maybe their anger, their need for retribution is somehow neutralized now that Stone is experiencing the same torment. Or maybe
they're still out there patrolling the ocean, watching for the next stone, the next embodiment of human greed and disregard for the natural world. It's like they've become guardians, protectors of the ocean, ensuring that Stone's fate serves as a warning to others who might follow in his footsteps.
That's a chilling thought, but it speaks to the enduring power of this story. It leaves us with a sense of unease, a lingering question about what might happen next. Will humanity heed the warning, or are we destined to repeat the cycle of exploitation and retribution?
And that brings us to another key question. What motivates Stone? What drives him to such extremes?
On the surface, it seems like pure greed and insatiable desire for wealth and power. But I think there's something deeper at play here. Stone seems driven by a need to prove himself, to conquer nature, to create something that will leave a lasting legacy.
You're right. It's almost as if he's trying to defy his own mortality, to create something that will outlive him, even if it comes at a terrible cost. And that desire, that ambition, is ultimately what blinds him to the consequences of his actions.
And it's a flaw that's not limited to fictional characters like Stone. We see it in the real world all the time. CEOs who prioritize profit over people, politicians who make decisions based on short-term gains rather than long-term sustainability, individuals who chase success at any cost.
It's like Requiem Wave is holding up a mirror to human nature, forcing us to confront the dark side of ambition and the potential for even our best intentions to lead to disastrous outcomes.
And it's a reminder that technology, for all its potential benefits, can also amplify our flaws, our greed, our short-sightedness.
The Leviathan is a perfect example of that. It's this technological marvel, the symbol of human ingenuity, but it's also incredibly fragile, vulnerable to the very forces it was designed to conquer.
And it's ultimately destroyed not just by the storm or the sea wraiths, but by its own complexity, its reliance on systems that are too intricate, too interconnected to withstand the unforeseen consequences of human error.
It's like the story is saying, be careful what you create because it might just come back to bite you.
And that bite might come in the form of spectral, vengeful sailors.
Exactly. We can't forget about the sea wraiths. They are a constant reminder that our actions have consequences, and those consequences can sometimes take on a life of their own.
And that's a perfect note to end this part of our deep dive. We've covered a lot of ground, from the motivations of our characters, to the fragility of technology, to the potential for the environment to become a force of retribution.
But there's still so much more to explore. Join us in part 3, where we'll explore the deeper implications of this story and discuss what it means for our own future. Welcome back to True Tomorrows. It's time to wrap up our deep dive into Requiem Wave, and I think it's safe to say this story has left us with a lot to think about.
Absolutely. We've been talking about ghost ships, greedy tycoons, and the ocean's long memory, but this story is about so much more than that.
One of the things that struck me about Requiem Wave is how it blends elements of science fiction with real-world anxieties about technology and the environment. It's almost as if the story is tapping into our collective unease about the pace of innovation and the unintended consequences it might unleash.
Right. It's like a dark mirror reflecting our own fears back at us. On one hand, we have this incredible potential to solve problems, to improve our lives, to push the boundaries of what's possible. But on the other hand, there's always this nagging question. At what cost are we creating a future that's sustainable, equitable, or are we just sowing the seeds of our own destruction?
And that's where the character of Admiral Stone becomes so fascinating. He's not just a villain, he's a representation of that Faustian bargain we often make with progress. He's willing to sacrifice anything, safety ethics, even human life, in pursuit of his ambition.
And in a way, he's a cautionary tale for all of us. The story seems to be asking, what compromises are we willing to make in the name of progress? Are we so focused on the destination that we've lost sight of the journey, the impact we're having along the way?
You might recall that scene in the story where Stone's daughter confronts him about his choices. She accuses him of being blinded by his ambition of sacrificing his humanity for the sake of his legacy. It's a powerful moment because it highlights the personal cost of unchecked ambition, how it can erode our values and alienate us from those we love.
Exactly. And it reminds us that progress isn't just about technological advancements, it's about moral and ethical evolution as well. Are we becoming better humans along with our technology, or are we sacrificing our humanity at the altar of innovation?
It's a question that Requiem Wave forces us to confront, and it doesn't offer any easy answers.
Yeah.
But I think that's what makes the story so compelling. It challenges us to think critically about the choices we make both individually and as a society.
And it reminds us that those choices have consequences, sometimes unforeseen and potentially devastating.
Speaking of consequences, the sea wraiths themselves represent a very visceral, almost primal form of accountability. They're not just seeking revenge, they're embodying the ocean's own sense of justice, a force that demands balance, that remembers the wrongs committed against it.
It's like they're a manifestation of our collective guilt, the shadow side of our progress. They represent the environmental damage we've inflicted, the lives lost in pursuit of profit, the exploitation of resources that has left scars on the planet.
And in a way, their transformation of Stone is a kind of twisted redemption. He's forced to confront the consequences of his actions, to experience the suffering he inflicted on others, to become one with the very force he sought to conquer.
It's a haunting fate, but it also speaks to the idea that even in the face of unimaginable tragedy, even when it seems like all is lost, there's still the possibility for transformation, for a reckoning with our past.
Right. It's not about punishment. It's about understanding, about facing the consequences of our choices, about becoming more aware of the interconnectedness of all things.
And it's about recognizing that true progress can't come at the expense of others, whether those others are human or the natural world itself.
So where do we go from here? What lessons can we take away from Requiem Wave and apply to our own lives?
I think the most important takeaway is the need for mindful innovation. We need to be more conscious of the potential consequences of our actions, to consider the long-term impact of our choices, to ensure that our pursuit of progress doesn't come at the expense of our humanity or the health of our planet.
It's about finding a balance between ambition and responsibility, between pushing the boundaries of what's possible while respecting the limits of our planet and ourselves.
And it's about remembering that the future isn't predetermined. We have the power to shape it, to create a world where technology serves humanity and the environment rather than exploiting them.
Well said. And on that note, I think it's time to wrap up our deep dive into Requiem Wave. This story has taken us on a journey through the dark side of innovation, the fragility of human ambition, and the haunting reminder that the ocean never forgets.
Thanks for joining us on this journey. We hope this story has sparked your imagination and left you with some food for thought. And remember, even in the face of unsettling possibilities, there's always hope for a better tomorrow. Keep exploring, keep questioning, and keep imagining.
And be sure to rate and follow True Tomorrows for more captivating stories that explore the frontiers of technology and the shadows they might hold. See you in the next episode.